The fire was lit before dawn, not for warmth, not for cooking. The village had enough warmth. The village had enough food. The fire was lit because it had always been lit on this morning, in this season, when the girls came of age. It was lit because the women who came before had lit it, and the women before them, going back so far that no living person could remember when the tradition began, only that it had always been, only that it would always be. She heard it crackling from inside the hut. She was 11 years old. She had not slept. No one had asked her how she felt about the morning. No one would. There is a word used in almost every culture that has ever practiced an initiation rite. The word is honor. It appears in different languages, wears different clothes, carries different names, but the function of the word is always the same. It arrives before the girl does. It settles over the ceremony like smoke. It tells everyone gathered, the mothers, the aunts, the grandmothers, the men waiting at the edge of the celebration, that what is about to happen is not being done to her, it is being done for her. The distinction matters, or rather the insistence on that distinction matters, because without it, the ceremony is simply a thing that happens to a child who cannot refuse. With it, the ceremony becomes a gift. This is how control has dressed itself throughout history, in ceremony, in fire, in the particular silence of adults who know exactly what they are doing and choose collectively to call it something else. Anthropologists who have spent their careers studying initiation rites across cultures tend to say carefully, and with appropriate qualification, that rites of passage serve a genuine social purpose. They are not wrong. At their most benign, these ceremonies mark a threshold. They say you were a child, and now you are crossing into something larger. They give a community the language to acknowledge growth, to celebrate it, to formalize the responsibilities that come with it. They create continuity between generations. They answer the disorienting question of who you are now by surrounding you with people who have already answered it for themselves. In some traditions, the ceremony was indeed a celebration. It was joyful. It was chosen in the sense that the culture had built a world where choosing otherwise was not a thought that had yet occurred to anyone. But human institutions do not stay in their most benign form. Power finds them. Economics finds them. The concerns of families, their reputations, their debts, their ambitions find them. And slowly, without any single moment of deliberate corruption, a ceremony that once marked growth begins to determine it, to fix it, to lock a life in place on a single morning before the girl at the center has had any chance to imagine who she might become without it. The age at which these ceremonies occurred was not accidental. In culture after culture, across centuries and continents, the ceremony was timed not to the girl's emotional readiness, but to her physical one, the first signs of puberty, the earliest possible indication that her body had become, in the language of those societies, marriageable. The ceremony was the announcement of that status. It did not follow readiness, it created obligation. In parts of sub-Saharan Africa, initiation ceremonies for girls involved weeks of seclusion, physical instruction, and, in many documented cases, procedures that permanently altered the body. These were not secret. They were the most public thing a family could do. The community gathered. The elders presided. Mothers who had undergone the same ritual years before stood witness, because their witnessing was proof that the tradition carried weight, that it had survived them and would survive their daughters too. In South Asia, certain castes and communities marked the onset of puberty with elaborate ceremonies that announced a girl's eligibility for marriage negotiations. The ceremony itself was not the negotiation, but it was the opening of it. It placed the family on a public record. It told the community, this girl is now available. She was rarely present in the discussions that followed. In parts of early modern Europe, certain religious and cultural ceremonies surrounding female adolescence were designed explicitly around purity, its demonstration, its preservation, its verification. The details were considered sacred. The architecture of those details was built almost entirely to serve the interests of men. Fathers negotiating marriages, future husbands demanding assurances, communities enforcing standards that determined whether a family rose or fell in local estimation. The girl was the occasion, she was rarely the point. The mark left by these ceremonies was not always physical. Sometimes the mark was social, and social marks are in some ways more durable than physical ones because they live in other people's memory. They live in the way a community looks at a girl after the ceremony, and, crucially, in the way a community looks at a girl who has not undergone it. This is the mechanism that made refusal nearly unthinkable. The ceremony did not simply confer status, it was the precondition for status. To skip it was not to remain neutral, it was to step outside the map entirely. To become a category the community had no language for, not a child, not a woman, not marriageable, not protected by the social arrangements that marriage provided. It was to become a question mark in a world that had no patience for unanswered questions.
Families understood this. They understood it viscerally, practically, economically. A daughter who had not been properly initiated was a liability. She could not be negotiated into a marriage alliance. She could not inherit certain protections. In some traditions, she could not be buried alongside her ancestors. The exclusion was not metaphorical, it was administrative. It was recorded in the same ledgers and memories that recorded births and deaths and land transfers and debts. The pressure on families was therefore not simply social, it was existential. To protect a daughter from the ceremony was, in the logic of those systems, to expose her to something far worse. This is how coercion operates when it is most sophisticated. It does not need to threaten, it simply builds a world in which there is only one door, and then it calls walking through that door a choice. There is a particular tension at the heart of these traditions that their practitioners rarely acknowledged and almost never named. The ceremonies were justified as protection, they were framed as preparation, they were presented as the mechanism by which a girl would be welcomed into the full rights and recognitions of adult womanhood. And yet the content of those ceremonies, when examined with any honesty, was almost exclusively about limitation. She was instructed in obedience. She was taught the architecture of submission, not as submission, but as grace, as dignity, as the mark of a properly raised woman. She was separated from her childhood friendships during the seclusion period, deliberately cut from the informal social bonds that might have given her a self independent of her family's requirements. She was introduced to the expectations of a future husband before she had ever met him, before he had been chosen, before she had any grounds to consent or object. The seclusion period, practiced in many traditions across West Africa, parts of South and Southeast Asia, and in modified forms in other regions, lasted days or weeks. During this time, the girl was in the company of elder women who transmitted cultural knowledge. Some of that knowledge was genuinely valuable, medicinal, relational, practical, but much of it was the systematic installation of a self-image built around service, endurance, and the understanding that her worth was tied to her performance of those things. She emerged from seclusion altered, not because anything had been taken from her in any single dramatic moment, but because she had been surrounded for an extended period by a concentrated version of what her society believed she should be. And human beings, especially young ones, especially isolated ones, tend to become what they are surrounded by. The ceremony did not just mark the threshold, it built the wall.
The economics of these systems were frank to the point of bluntness, even if no one at the ceremony would have described them that way. In societies that practiced bride wealth, where the groom's family paid the bride's family, the successful completion of a girl's initiation ceremony was a significant factor in the negotiation. A properly initiated girl was worth more. The calculation was not hidden. It was discussed openly between families, carried in the memory of every matchmaker and marriage broker, understood by every father watching his daughter walk toward the fire. In dowry systems, the logic ran in the opposite direction, but served the same function. The family paying the dowry expected something in return: a girl who had been properly formed by her tradition, who carried the right certificates of character and ritual compliance. The ceremony was that certificate. The girl, in both systems, occupied the position of the commodity being traded, not cruelly in many cases, not with any conscious acknowledgement of that framing. The families involved genuinely believed they were doing right by her. They were building her future, securing her place, protecting her from the far worse alternatives that awaited uninitiated, unmarried women in those societies. But the structure was not altered by the sincerity of the participants. A thing can be done with love and still be a cage. Refusal in most of these traditions was not simply difficult, it was architecturally impossible. Legal systems in many societies, colonial and pre-colonial alike, recognized the authority of family and community over the reproductive and ceremonial decisions affecting girls. A father's consent was required for marriage. A mother's compliance was required for initiation. The girl herself was not a legal entity in the relevant sense. Her preferences were not a category the law had made room for. The rare cases of refusal that do appear in historical records are remarkable precisely because of what surrounded them. The community response to a girl who refused was not simply disapproval, it was a coordinated withdrawal. Families stopped speaking to her family. Suitors were warned away. Religious authorities invoked the displeasure of ancestors and deities. In some documented cases, girls who refused initiation were subjected to forms of social pressure that amounted to psychological coercion, sleep deprivation, extended isolation, the removal of food, the persistent repetition of the message that she was bringing ruin to everyone who loved her. The message was effective because it was largely true. She was bringing ruin to everyone who loved her, within the logic of that system. She was a stone thrown into a machinery that had been running for generations. The gears were real. The damage was real.
This is perhaps the most difficult thing to hold steady in the mind when examining these histories, that the individuals enforcing the system were not, for the most part, villains. They were participants in a logic so old and so thoroughly embedded that they could not see it as a logic at all. It simply appeared to them as reality, as the nature of things, as what women were and what ceremonies were for. The cruelty was not personal, it was structural, and structural cruelty is the kind that endures longest because there is no single person to blame, no single moment of decision to point to. There is only the accumulated weight of 1,000 small agreements made over generations that together add up to something a single individual cannot lift. She did not speak when she came out. This is noted in accounts from multiple cultures, multiple centuries. The girl who has undergone initiation returns to the community changed not just in status, but in some quality of presence that observers noticed and interpreted as maturity, as gravity, as the mark of someone who now understands something about the world. Elders who witnessed the return of initiated girls often described a particular quality in the eyes, a stillness, a knowledge. What they were describing, what they called wisdom, was almost certainly something else. It was the expression of a young person who has been shown the full weight of what her life is expected to be, and has understood for the first time that there is no negotiation available to her. The stillness in the eyes was not wisdom, it was the particular quality of a person absorbing the permanent. Some girls came back genuinely proud, genuinely transformed in ways that felt like growth, that felt like the ceremony had given them something real. This is also true. Humans are not simple. We find meaning in what we are given, and sometimes the meaning we find is authentic even when the giving was coercive. A person can be shaped by force and still become, through their own intelligence and will, something that transcends the shaping. But the pride of those girls does not change the architecture. It does not make the door optional. It does not restore the question that was never asked. The people who first pushed back against these systems were, in almost every documented case, women who had been through them. Not outsiders, not reformers arriving from elsewhere with new theories. The first critics were almost always insiders, women who had undergone the ceremonies, who understood them from the inside, who had experienced their weight and looked at the daughters coming up behind them and felt something shift. In Kenya, the movement against female genital cutting in the early 20th century was driven significantly by Kikuyu Christian women who proposed alternative ceremonies, initiation rites that retained the social and community significance of the transition without the physical procedure. They were not rejecting tradition, they were insisting that tradition was not the same thing as the harm embedded within it. The distinction was fierce and necessary and politically dangerous to make. In India, reform movements targeting child marriage and forced participation in certain ceremonial practices were built partly on the testimony of women who had been married young, who had undergone ceremonies they had not chosen, and who had spent decades understanding the cost. Their testimony was not political argument, it was memory, and memory, delivered with precision, is more powerful than argument. In parts of West Africa and Southeast Asia, women's collectives in the late 20th century began developing what anthropologists came to call alternative rites, ceremonies that preserved the communal, the celebratory, the intergenerational, while removing the elements that caused harm. These were not replacements imposed from outside, they were mutations proposed from within. They were the tradition correcting itself, slowly, painfully, against significant resistance. The resistance was always framed in the same language. This is our culture. You are destroying what we are. To change this is to erase us. The women proposing the changes had a response, which they did not always say aloud, but which was present in every conversation. We are not erasing you. We are asking you to survive without hurting us. The colonial encounter added a layer of complexity to these histories that is still not fully resolved. When European colonial powers, British, French, Belgian, Portuguese, encountered initiation practices they found objectionable, their responses ranged from bureaucratic prohibition to active violent suppression. Girls were removed from communities, ceremonies were criminalized, families were fined or imprisoned for practicing traditions that had organized their social world for centuries. The colonial prohibition of certain initiation rites did not come from a principled commitment to the agency of girls and women. It came from the same source as most colonial policy, the desire to replace one system of control with another. The Europeans who banned these ceremonies were not offering freedom, they were rearranging the architecture of constraint. Girls who had been freed from one set of obligations were placed into mission schools, domestic service, and the expectations of a different civilizational project that also had no particular interest in their preferences.
This history matters because it is still used in communities today and legitimately as evidence that outside criticism of these practices is tainted, that the abolition of harmful traditions cannot be separated from the colonial project that also abolished sovereignty, language, and dignity, that demands for change carry the smell of that older violence. The argument deserves to be heard carefully. It is not wrong about the history. It is wrong only when it is used to end the conversation rather than complicate it. Because the fact that colonial powers misused reform as a tool of domination does not make the harm in the ceremony disappear. Both things are true, and the path through them is not comfortable, and communities have been walking it, imperfectly and bravely, for generations. The records are incomplete. This is not an accident. In societies where women's experiences were not considered worth formal documentation, the history of these ceremonies exists largely in the margins, in oral accounts passed between women, in the diaries of missionaries who understood what they witnessed only through their own limited frameworks, in the anthropological notes of researchers who arrived with their own assumptions and left with conclusions shaped by them. The girls themselves were almost never asked to write down what happened. The tradition of not asking them continued into the archives. What this means is that the history of these practices is partly a history of silence. Not the silence of nothing happening, but the silence of the people to whom things were happening being systematically excluded from the record. Their absence from the documents is not evidence that their experience was uncomplicated. It is evidence that no one thought their complication was worth preserving. This is its own form of the same logic. The ceremony marked them, the record ignored them. From the beginning of their lives to the end, the architecture of the world they inhabited was built on the principle that their interior experience was not the relevant data. Some communities today practice modified versions of traditional initiation ceremonies. Some communities have abandoned them entirely. Some are in the middle of long, difficult internal debates about which elements carry meaning worth preserving and which carry harm worth releasing.
These debates are not clean. They involve grandmothers who love their granddaughters and believe with complete sincerity that the ceremony is protective. They involve young women who want to belong to their community and also want to belong to themselves. They involve men whose understanding of women's worth was formed inside these systems and who mistake that formation for truth. They involve governments, NGOs, international bodies, local councils, and community elders, all of whom have different definitions of the same words: tradition, harm, choice, culture. The debates are slow. The outcomes are uneven. Some communities have reformed in ways that have held. Others have reached formal agreements to change and then resumed traditional practices quietly when the attention moved elsewhere. The enforcement of prohibition, legal or social, has a mixed record. What has the most consistent record of producing lasting change is when the people inside the tradition become the agents of its transformation. When the women who have lived it decide what it should become. That is slow. It is not spectacular. It does not make for a simple story, but it is the only process that has produced change that stays changed. The fire burned for hours. Long after the ceremony was over, long after the girl had been led back and the community had dispersed and the day had turned toward evening and then toward night, the fire was still going. The embers held heat in a way that was almost stubborn. The adults who had gathered and witnessed and celebrated were in their homes by then. They had done their part. The tradition had been upheld. The community had confirmed, once again, that it was still itself. The girl lay somewhere in the dark, listening to the sound of the night, carrying something she had not carried when she woke up that morning. Whether it was too heavy or the right weight, or something she would grow into, she did not yet know. She was 11 years old. She had not slept the night before. She would not sleep well for a long time. In the morning, people would call her a woman. The word would not fit. It almost never fits at first, but the word, once applied, does not wait for the fit to arrive. The word determines the expectations determine the life, and the life, circumscribed, designated, fixed in place by a morning that offered no alternative, would proceed in the direction the ceremony had pointed it. That is the mechanism, not the fire, not the ritual objects or the instruction or the seclusion period. The mechanism is the moment when a community decides, collectively and without announcement, that a child's future has already been written and that the ceremony is not the beginning of her becoming, but the seal on what she was always going to be. A rite of passage should open a future. History shows that sometimes it sealed one instead.